The dust danced on the horizon as the last rays of sunlight painted the Montana sky in a canvas of amber and purple. Garrett Young pulled his wagon to a halt at the edge of Marysville, his shoulders aching from the long journey that had begun before dawn. The small mining town, nestled in the shadow of the mountains, had grown considerably since the gold strikes of 1864, but it still maintained the rugged character of a frontier settlement. He hadn't intended to stop until he reached his homestead 5 miles outside of town, but his horses needed rest and water after the grueling haul from Helena. Garrett climbed down from the driver's seat, his boots hitting the hard, packed dirt with a thud. At 32, his face was weathered from years under the harsh western sun, but his green eyes remained sharp and alert, taking in his surroundings with careful consideration. "Come on, boys," he murmured to his team of horses, leading them toward the small stream that ran alongside the trail. As they drank, Garrett stretched his back and gazed at the town in the distance. Marysville had been good to him since he'd arrived from Pennsylvania 7 years ago. After serving in the Union Army during the war between the states, he'd headed west like so many other restless souls, eventually staking a claim on a patch of land suitable for raising cattle. After watering the horses, Garrett decided to make camp rather than push on to his ranch in the dark. He'd already been traveling for 16 hours, and the thought of a hot meal and rest was too tempting to resist. He unhitched the team and set up a small campfire, pulling supplies from the wagon to prepare a simple dinner of beans and jerky. The night settled around him like a heavy blanket, the stars emerging one by one above the rolling hills. Garrett finished his meal and spread his bedroll near the fire, his Winchester rifle within arm's reach. Though Montana Territory in 1871 was becoming more civilized, old habits died hard for a man who'd survived both war and the untamed wilderness. Sleep came quickly, but it wasn't deep. Years of living alone had made Garrett a light sleeper, alert to any sound that didn't belong to the night. Which was why, just before dawn, the slight scraping noise beneath his wagon immediately brought him to full consciousness. His hand closed around the rifle as he rose silently to his feet. Another sound fabric rustling against wood. Crouching low, Garrett approached the wagon, his movements deliberate and silent. Whoever was underneath was trying to be quiet, but not quite managing it. With rifle raised, Garrett dropped to one knee and peered beneath the wagon. What he saw made him lower his weapon immediately. A woman, curled into a tight ball, her dress tattered and dirty, her dark hair falling in tangled waves around her face. She appeared to be asleep, though her body trembled slightly in the pre-dawn chill. For a long moment, Garrett simply stared, uncertain what to do. She was clearly hiding from what or whom he couldn't say. But there was something in her desperate posture, in the way she had tucked herself against the wagon wheel, that spoke of genuine fear. Making his decision, Garrett stood and returned to his bedroll. He added wood to the dying fire, bringing it back to crackling life, then set his coffee pot at the edge of the flames. If she was running from something, she had her reasons. He wouldn't force her out or demand explanations. When she was ready, she would emerge. The coffee was just beginning to boil when he heard movement. Garrett kept his eyes on the fire, giving her the choice to reveal herself or flee. He heard the soft shuffle of feet on dirt, then a hesitant voice. "I'm sorry." Garrett turned slowly. The woman stood a few yards away, poised as if to run at any moment. In the gray light of dawn, he could see she was young, perhaps 20 or so, with eyes the color of midnight. Despite the dirt and fatigue etched on her face, there was a fierce dignity in her posture. "Coffee's almost ready," Garrett said simply, gesturing to the pot. "Got some biscuits too if you're hungry." Confusion flickered across her face, followed by wariness. "You're not." "Angry," Garrett shook his head. "Figured you had your reasons." She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether his offer was genuine or a trap. Finally, hunger seemed to win out over caution. She approached the fire, though she maintained a careful distance between them. "I'm Garrett Young," he said, pouring coffee into a tin cup and offering it to her. She hesitated before accepting it, her fingers brushing against his briefly. "Willow," she replied. "Willow Martinez." Garrett nodded, not pressing for more information. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a cloth-wrapped package of biscuits, offering her one. She took it gratefully, though she ate with deliberate slowness, as if savoring each bite or perhaps making it last. "I didn't steal anything," she said suddenly, her eyes meeting his. "I just needed somewhere to sleep." "Never thought you did," Garrett replied. "Wagon's not the most comfortable place, though." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Better than the alternative." They sat in silence as the sun crept over the horizon, painting the landscape in gold. Garrett didn't ask the questions that burned in his mind: why she was alone, what she was running from, where she was headed. Instead, he offered her a second cup of coffee, which she accepted with a nod of thanks. As the morning light strengthened, Garrett could see her more clearly. Her dress, though worn and dusty, had once been of good quality. Her hands, though calloused, showed signs of having known a gentler life, and her speech, despite its current wariness, carried traces of education. "I'm heading to my ranch," Garrett said finally, as he began packing up his camp. "It's about 5 miles west of Marysville. You're welcome to ride along if you've a mind to." Willow looked toward the town, then back at him. Indecision warred on her face. "I don't mean to presume," Garrett added quickly. "Just an offer of a safe ride, nothing more. I've got a small cabin with a spare room. My housekeeper, Mrs. Baxter, comes by 3 times a week. You could clean up, rest, figure out your next steps." "Why would you help a stranger?" Willow asked, suspicion edging her voice. Garrett considered his answer carefully. "Because someone once did the same for me, when I needed it most." He paused, loading his coffee pot into the wagon. "And because these hills aren't kind to those traveling alone, especially women." Willow looked down at her worn boots, then toward the town again. Whatever she saw there or feared seeing seemed to make her decision. "I accept your offer, Mr. Young," she said formally. "But only for a day or two." Garrett nodded, respecting her boundaries. "Fair enough." As they prepared to depart, Willow helped with the remaining camp chores, demonstrating a quiet efficiency that suggested she was no stranger to hard work. When she climbed onto the wagon seat beside him, Garrett noticed she kept glancing nervously toward Marysville, as if expecting pursuit. "Is there trouble in town I should know about?" he asked, keeping his tone casual as he flicked the reins to set the horses in motion. Willow tensed. "Not the kind that should follow to your doorstep," she replied after a moment. "At least, I hope not." Garrett nodded, accepting her cryptic answer for now. Whatever ghosts chased this woman, they were hers to reveal or conceal as she saw fit. The wagon lurched forward, heading away from Marysville and deeper into the rolling Montana countryside. The 5-mile journey to Garrett's ranch passed mostly in silence. Willow sat rigidly beside him, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Occasionally, Garrett would point out landmarks: the creek that ran through his property, the distant mountains that sheltered his land from the worst of the winter winds, the old oak tree where he'd built his first shelter before constructing the cabin. As they crested a final hill, his ranch came into view. It was modest by some standards, a solid log cabin with a stone chimney, a barn, corral, and grazing land stretching toward distant cottonwoods that marked the creek's path. But to Garrett, It represented years of hard work and determination. "It's not much," he said as the wagon rolled toward the cabin, "but it's paid for." "It's beautiful," Willow said softly, and something in her voice suggested she meant it. As they approached, a dog came bounding from behind the cabin, a rangy black and white border collie that barked enthusiastically at their arrival. "That's Scout," Garrett explained. "Best cattle dog in the territory, though he's convinced he's in charge around here." A smile tugged at Willow's lips as she watched the dog race circles around the wagon, clearly delighted by their return. It was the first genuine smile Garrett had seen from her, and it transformed her face, revealing a beauty that hardship and fear had temporarily masked. Garrett pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin and set the brake. "Home sweet home," he said, climbing down and coming around to offer Willow a hand. She hesitated only briefly before accepting his assistance, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. The cabin was neat and simple, a main room with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with chairs, bookshelves surprisingly well stocked for a frontier home, and a comfortable-looking armchair. 2 doors led off the main room, presumably to bedrooms. "Mrs. Baxter keeps things in order," Garrett explained as he showed her inside. "She's due tomorrow, but she won't trouble you with questions. She's discreet." Willow nodded gratefully, her eyes taking in every detail of the cabin. "You have a lot of books," she observed, moving toward the shelves. "Reading passes the winter evenings," Garrett replied, pleased by her interest. "Help yourself to any of them." He showed her to the spare bedroom, small but clean, with a narrow bed, a chest for clothing, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. "The washroom's out back. I'll heat some water for you if you'd like to clean up." "Thank you," Willow said, standing awkwardly in the center of the room. "For all of this, She trailed off as if uncertain how to express her gratitude. "No need," Garrett said simply. "Rest. I'll be outside tending to the horses if you need anything." He left her alone, closing the door behind him. As he walked toward the barn, Scout at his heels, Garrett found himself wondering about the mysterious woman who had appeared under his wagon. Whatever trouble followed her, it seemed serious enough to drive her to hiding beneath a stranger's vehicle in the middle of nowhere. Garrett unhitched the horses and led them into the barn, removing their tack and brushing them down. The familiar routine calmed him, giving him time to consider his unexpected guest. His instincts told him she wasn't dangerous, at least not to him, but she was certainly in some kind of danger herself. After caring for the horses, Garrett pumped water into buckets and heated it over the outdoor fire pit, carrying it to the wash house behind the cabin. He knocked lightly on the bedroom door to let Willow know the water was ready, then returned to the barn to unload the supplies he'd purchased in Helena. It was nearly an hour later when he heard the cabin door open. Willow stepped onto the porch, and Garrett nearly dropped the sack of flour he was carrying. She had washed the dirt from her face and combed her long, dark hair, which now hung in damp waves down her back. She'd obviously found a way to clean her dress as well, for though it was still worn, the fabric no longer carried the dust of the road. "I hope you don't mind," she said, noticing his surprise. "I found soap and a comb in the wash house." "Not at all," Garrett replied, setting down his burden. "Feel better?" A genuine smile touched her lips. "Very much, thank you." Something shifted in Garrett's chest at that smile, a warmth he hadn't felt in a very long time. He quickly turned his attention back to unloading the wagon, dismissing the feeling as simple satisfaction at helping someone in need. "Are you hungry?" he asked, carrying a crate of canned goods toward the cabin. "I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage bacon and eggs." "I can cook," Willow offered, stepping forward to take some of the smaller packages. "It's the least I can do to repay your kindness." Garrett started to protest, but saw the determined set of her jaw and realized she needed to feel useful. "That would be welcome," he said instead. Together, they carried the supplies into the cabin, working in companionable silence to store everything away. Garrett was struck by how naturally Willow seemed to move through his home, as if she instinctively understood where things belonged. When the wagon was empty, she set about preparing a meal while Garrett finished tending to the outdoor chores. The scent of frying bacon greeted him when he returned to the cabin, making his stomach growl appreciatively. Willow stood at the stove, her movements confident as she flipped the bacon and stirred something in another pan. "Found some potatoes," she explained, glancing over her shoulder. "Hope that's all right." "More than all right," Garrett assured her, washing his hands in the basin by the door. "It's been a while since I had a proper meal that wasn't Mrs. Baxter's cooking." They ate at the table by the window, the late afternoon sun streaming through the glass. The food was simple but delicious: crisp bacon, fluffy eggs, and potatoes fried with onions and herbs from the small garden behind the cabin. "This is wonderful," Garrett said after his first few bites. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" A shadow passed over Willow's face. "My mother taught me," she said quietly. "Before she died." Garrett nodded, recognizing the pain in her voice. "My ma was a fine cook too," he offered. "Made bread that would make angels weep, my pa used to say." Willow's expression softened. "Are they still living?" "No," Garrett replied, the old grief a dull ache now rather than the sharp pain it once had been. "Lost them both to influenza when I was 17. That was before the war." "You fought?" Willow asked, her dark eyes studying his face. "Union Army. 4 years." Garrett didn't elaborate, and Willow didn't press. They finished the meal in comfortable silence, and when they were done, Willow insisted on washing the dishes while Garrett stoked the fire against the evening chill. As darkness fell outside, they sat on opposite sides of the hearth, the crackling flames the only sound in the room. "I should explain," Willow said suddenly, her eyes fixed on the fire. "Why you found me under your wagon." Garrett looked up from the book he'd been pretending to read. "You don't owe me any explanations." "Perhaps not," she agreed, "but I'd like to give them all the same." Setting aside his book, Garrett turned his full attention to her. In the firelight, her face was a study in shadows and golden light, her expression a mixture of resolve and uncertainty. "I was married," she began, her voice low, "to a man named Edward Bishop. He owns the largest mine in Marysville and half the businesses in town." She twisted her hands in her lap. "I was 18 when we wed, the daughter of a seamstress who couldn't afford to turn down the offer of such a wealthy son-in-law." Garrett remained silent, letting her tell her story at her own pace. "At first he was kind, generous even, but after my mother died last year he changed. Or perhaps he simply stopped pretending." Willow's voice hardened. "He became controlling, then cruel." She broke off, taking a deep breath. "He hurt me. Not where anyone could see, of course. Edward is very careful about appearances." Anger flared in Garrett's chest, but he kept his expression neutral. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Willow nodded, acknowledging his sympathy. 3 days ago, I learned he had arranged to send me to an asylum in the East. He told people I was becoming unstable, a danger to myself. The truth is, I had threatened to leave him and he couldn't bear the humiliation." "So you ran," Garrett concluded. "Yes. I took what little money I had hidden away and fled. I've been hiding in the hills, afraid to go into any town where he might have connections." She looked up at him, her eyes fierce despite the fear in them. "I'm not crazy, Mr. Young. I never thought you were," Garrett assured her. "And it's Garrett, please." Willow relaxed slightly, though her posture remained tense. "I didn't know where I was going when I saw your wagon." I was exhausted, and it seemed like a safe place to rest for a few hours. She shook her head. I never expected such kindness from a stranger. What will you do now? Garrett asked gently. I'm not sure, Willow admitted. I had thought to keep heading west, perhaps to Oregon or California. Somewhere he wouldn't think to look for me. She hesitated. But I have so little money and no skills that would earn me a living in a city. Garrett considered her situation. A woman alone faced countless dangers on the frontier, and a woman fleeing an abusive, powerful husband faced even more. Before he could think better of it, he made an offer. Stay here, he said. At least until you've had time to make proper plans. The ranch is isolated enough that few visitors come calling, and those who do have no connection to your husband. When Willow began to protest, he held up a hand. Mrs. Baxter could use help with the household, and I could certainly use another pair of hands come harvest time. You'd be earning your keep, not accepting charity. Willow studied him, clearly trying to determine his motives. Why would you take such a risk for someone you don't know? Garrett considered his answer carefully. Because it's the right thing to do, he said finally, and because I know what it's like to need a safe harbor. After a long moment, Willow nodded. Thank you, Garrett. I accept your offer for now. She rose from her chair. If you don't mind, I think I'll retire. It's been quite a day. Of course, Garrett replied, standing as well. Sleep well, Willow. After she had gone to her room, Garrett remained by the fire, troubled by her story yet certain he had made the right decision. Whatever came of offering shelter to Edward Bishop's runaway wife, he would face it when the time came. For now, he was simply glad she was safe. The days passed quickly as Willow settled into life at the ranch. Mrs. Baxter, a sturdy widow in her 60s with sharp eyes and a kind heart, arrived the next day as expected. Garrett introduced Willow simply as a friend who would be staying for a while, and to her credit, Mrs. Baxter asked no questions, though her raised eyebrows spoke volumes. To Garrett's surprise, the two women formed an immediate bond. Mrs. Baxter taught Willow the routines of the household, and Willow proved an eager and capable student. By the end of the first week, she had taken over much of the cooking and had begun helping with other tasks around the ranch, feeding chickens, tending the vegetable garden, and even learning to milk the 2 cows Garrett kept for dairy. Garrett found himself watching her more than he should, impressed by her determination to learn new skills and her resilience in the face of adversity. Despite everything she had endured, Willow maintained a quiet dignity that he admired. And when she occasionally laughed at Scout's antics or smiled at a sunset, Garrett felt something inside him lighten in response. 2 weeks after Willow's arrival, Garrett needed to go into Marysville for supplies. He was reluctant to leave her alone, but Mrs. Baxter would be at the ranch and he couldn't put off the trip any longer. I'll be back by nightfall, he promised Willow as he prepared to depart. Stay close to the house. Worry creased her brow. Be careful in town, Garrett. If Edward suspects I'm in the area. I'll be discreet, he assured her, and I know how to handle myself. The ride to Marysville took just over an hour. As Garrett guided his wagon down the main street, he was acutely aware of the risk he was taking. Edward Bishop was a powerful man in these parts, and if he discovered that Garrett was harboring his wife, there would be consequences. The general store was busy when Garrett entered, locals gathering to exchange news and gossip as much as to purchase goods. He nodded to familiar faces as he made his way to the counter, where Silas Thompson, the proprietor, greeted him warmly. Garrett Young, haven't seen you in weeks. Beginning to think you'd decided to become a complete hermit up there in the hills. Garrett smiled easily, though his senses remained alert. Just busy with the ranch. Spring's a demanding season. As Silas filled his order, Garrett listened to the conversations around him, picking up fragments of local news: a new silver strike in the mountains, trouble with cattle rustlers to the north, a traveling preacher expected next Sunday. And then, a name that made him tense. Bishop's offering $100 for information about his wife, a gruff voice said from the corner. Says she wandered off during a spell of madness and might be a danger to herself. Shame about that, another voice replied. Such a pretty young thing. Never seemed crazy to me the few times I saw her in town. Well, you know how these delicate women can be, the first man said. One minute they're fine, the next they're raving. My cousin had a wife like that, had to be institutionalized. Garrett kept his expression neutral as he paid for his supplies, though anger burned in his gut. $100 was a fortune in these parts, enough to tempt even decent folks to betray their neighbors. Anything else you need, Garrett? Silas asked as he wrapped the last of the purchases. Just some information, Garrett replied carefully. This business with Bishop's wife, when did she disappear? Silas lowered his voice. About 2.5 weeks ago. Bishop's got men searching every homestead within 20 miles. Even had the sheriff deputize some extra men to help. He shook his head. Between you and me, I never much cared for Bishop, cold sort of man, but losing a wife that way, rough business. Garrett nodded non-committally. Thanks for the warning, I'll keep an eye out on my property. As he loaded his wagon, Garrett noticed 2 men watching him from across the street, hard-faced strangers wearing deputy badges. His instincts hummed with warning, but he maintained an air of casual indifference, securing his purchases and climbing onto the wagon seat as if he hadn't a care in the world. The men made no move to approach him, but as Garrett drove out of town, he could feel their eyes following him. The knowledge that Bishop was actively searching for Willow, with the law apparently on his side, added urgency to his return journey. The sun was beginning its descent when Garrett arrived back at the ranch. As he pulled the wagon to a stop, Willow emerged from the cabin, relief evident on her face when she saw him. "You're back," she said, coming to help unload the supplies. "Was everything all right in town?" Garrett debated whether to share what he had learned, but decided honesty was the best course. As they carried packages into the cabin, he told her about the reward and the search parties. Willow's face paled, but she remained composed. "I should leave," she said once they were inside. "I'm putting you in danger by staying here." "Where would you go?" Garrett asked gently. "With men searching every homestead, the hills aren't safe, and you can't outrun them on foot." Frustration flashed in her eyes. "I can't just hide here forever, waiting to be found." "Not forever," Garrett agreed. "But for now, this is still the safest place for you." He hesitated, then added, "There's a line shack about 10 miles west of here, up in the high pasture. If trouble comes, you could hide there while I deal with it." Willow paced the small room, her agitation evident in every movement. "I never meant to bring this trouble to your door, Garrett. You've been nothing but kind, and I've repaid you by making you a target for Edward's vengeance." Garrett stepped forward, halting her pacing with a gentle hand on her arm. "Willow, look at me," he said quietly. When she raised her eyes to his, he continued, "I chose to help you. I understood the risks then, and I understand them now. I don't regret my decision." For a long moment, they stood close enough that Garrett could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, could feel the warmth of her through the thin fabric of her sleeve. Something shifted between them, a tension that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the growing awareness of each other that had been building over the past weeks. Willow broke the contact first, stepping back with a murmured thanks. But that moment lingered between them, changing the air in the small cabin. That night, they sat on the porch after dinner, watching as stars emerged in the darkening sky. Scout lay at Garrett's feet, occasionally raising his head to sniff the evening breeze before settling back down with a contented sigh. "Tell me about your life before the war," Willow said suddenly. "You rarely speak of your past." Garrett considered the question, his eyes on the distant mountains. "There's not much to tell. Grew up in Pennsylvania, son of a blacksmith. Learned the trade from my father, expected to follow in his footsteps." "But you didn't," Willow observed. "No," Garrett agreed. "After my parents died, I sold the forge and enlisted. Spent 4 years fighting a war I barely understood at first, and when it was over, I couldn't face going back to a place filled with ghosts." "So you came west?" "So I came west," he echoed. "Worked as a blacksmith in mining camps, saved every penny until I could afford this land. Been building it up ever since." Willow was silent for a moment, absorbing his story. "Have you never wanted a family of your own?" The question caught him off guard, though he'd asked himself the same thing on lonely winter nights. "I did once," he admitted. "There was a woman in one of the mining camps, Catherine. We were to be married." "What happened?" Willow asked softly when he didn't continue. "Cholera," Garrett said, the word still bitter after all these years. "Swept through the camp in '67. Took a third of the population in 2 weeks, including Catherine." "I'm sorry," Willow said, genuine compassion in her voice. Garrett nodded, accepting her sympathy. "After that, I focused on building this place. Figured it was safer that way." "Safer than risking that kind of loss again," Garrett clarified, surprising himself with his honesty. He rarely spoke of Catherine or the pain of losing her, yet with Willow the words came naturally. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the night deepening around them. Finally, Willow spoke again. "I always wanted children," she said, her voice wistful. "A house full of them with laughter and chaos and love." She sighed. "When I married Edward, I thought I would have that. But as time passed, and I saw who he truly was, I began to be grateful when no child came. I couldn't bear to bring a child into that kind of fear and unhappiness." Garrett understood then that despite everything, Willow had found a kind of freedom in her escape, not just from physical danger, but from the death of her dreams. Here, in this quiet moment under the stars, she could speak of those dreams again, could perhaps begin to believe they might still be possible. "It's not too late," he said gently. "You're young, Willow. There's time for the life you want." She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Sometimes I believe that. Other times I feel like I'll be running forever." "You won't," Garrett promised, a conviction in his voice that surprised them both. "One way or another, this will be resolved. You'll have your chance at happiness." What he didn't say, couldn't say, was how increasingly he imagined her finding that happiness here, with him. The thought had crept up on him gradually over the past weeks, taking root so deeply that he could no longer ignore it. But Willow was still legally another man's wife, still in danger, still recovering from wounds both visible and hidden. He had no right to burden her with his growing feelings. As if sensing his thoughts, Willow reached across the space between their chairs and briefly touched his hand. "Thank you, Garrett, for everything." That touch lingered with him long after they had said goodnight and retired to their separate rooms. It followed him into his dreams, where the possibility of a future with Willow seemed less impossible than in the waking world. The next 2 weeks passed in relative peace. Mrs. Baxter continued to visit regularly, bringing news from town but no word of searchers venturing near Garrett's property. Willow grew more confident in her skills around the ranch, even learning to ride one of the gentler horses so she could help Garrett check fence lines and move cattle to fresh pasture. On a warm afternoon in late May, they rode together to the creek that marked the eastern boundary of Garrett's land. The water ran high with spring runoff, the banks lush with new growth. They dismounted near a stand of cottonwoods, letting the horses drink while they stretched their legs. Willow had changed in the month since Garrett had found her beneath his wagon. The haunted look had faded from her eyes, replaced by a quiet confidence. She had filled out a bit, the regular meals adding a healthy glow to her skin and softness to her frame. And she smiled more genuine smiles that transformed her face and made Garrett's heart beat a little faster each time. As they walked along the creek bank, Willow bent to pick wildflowers, gathering them into a small bouquet. "Mrs. Baxter taught me the names of all these," she said, holding them up for Garrett to see. "This blue one is lupine and the yellow are buttercups. The little white stars are chickweed." Garrett smiled, enjoying her enthusiasm. "My mother would have liked you," he said without thinking. She loved wildflowers too. Used to say God made them special just to make people smile. Willow looked pleased at the comparison. "I wish I could have known her. She sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Garrett agreed. "Taught me most of what matters in life. Honesty, hard work, kindness." He paused, watching as Willow added another flower to her collection. "She also taught me to recognize a good heart when I found one." Willow glanced up at him, a question in her eyes. Before she could speak, however, the sound of approaching horses broke the peaceful moment. Garrett tensed, instinctively moving in front of Willow as he peered through the trees toward the source of the noise. "Get back to the horses," he said quietly. "Be ready to ride if needed." Willow nodded, dropping her flowers as she moved swiftly to where their mounts waited. Garrett drew his revolver, moving cautiously toward the edge of the trees. 3 riders came into view on the trail that ran alongside the creek, 2 men Garrett didn't recognize, and in the center, a figure he knew only by reputation. Edward Bishop was a striking man in his mid-40s, expensively dressed even for a casual ride, with silver threading through his dark hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His posture spoke of a man accustomed to command. Garrett slipped back into the cover of the trees, making his way quickly to Willow, who stood white-faced beside the horses. "It's him," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "Edward." "Take my horse," Garrett instructed, helping her mount the larger animal. "Ride back to the ranch, get your things, and head for the line shack I told you about. Scout will guide you, he knows the way." He whistled softly, and the border collie, who had been exploring nearby, trotted over obediently. "What about you?" Willow asked, her hands gripping the reins tightly. "I'll follow with your horse in a few minutes. Need to make sure they don't see you leaving." Garrett reached up to squeeze her hand. "Don't worry, just go now." With a last, fearful glance, Willow nudged the horse forward, Scout running alongside as they disappeared into the trees heading west, away from the approaching riders. Garrett waited until she was out of sight, then led Willow's horse deeper into the cottonwood grove, tethering it where it wouldn't be easily spotted. Moving carefully to avoid being seen, he returned to the creek bank, positioning himself where he could observe the riders without revealing his presence. They had stopped about 100 yards downstream, dismounting to water their horses. Garrett strained to hear their conversation, catching fragments carried on the breeze. "Waste of time," one of the men was saying. "Young's place is too far from town for a woman on foot." "We check every property," Bishop replied, his voice cold and authoritative. "Every cabin, every barn, every outbuilding. I want my wife found." "Yes, sir," the man replied, chastened. Garrett's mind raced. If they were heading to his ranch, he needed to reach Willow, make sure she was safely away before they arrived. But if he left now, they might see him and give chase. The decision was made for him when Bishop remounted his horse and pointed upstream directly toward the spot where Garrett hid. With no time to retreat, Garrett stepped out of the trees, making a show of adjusting his hat as if he had just arrived. "Afternoon, gentlemen," he called, walking toward them with deliberate casualness. "Something I can help you with." The three riders approached, Bishop's eyes narrowing as he studied Garrett. "You're Young, aren't you? The rancher?" Garrett nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "Garrett Young, yes. And you would be?" "Edward Bishop," the man replied, not offering his hand. "These are my associates, Mr. Reynolds and Mr. Dawson." The two men nodded curtly, their eyes watchful. "What brings you to my property, Mr. Bishop?" Garrett asked, maintaining his calm demeanor despite the tension crackling in the air. "My wife has gone missing," Bishop said, his gaze never leaving Garrett's face. "We're checking all properties in the area. She's unwell. I'm concerned for her safety." "Sorry to hear that," Garrett replied. "Can't say I've seen any strange women wandering about. Then again, I don't get many visitors out this way." Bishop dismounted, handing his reins to one of his men. He approached Garrett, stopping uncomfortably close. "Mr. Young, I should make myself clear. My wife is not simply missing, she is dangerously disturbed. Her doctor had recommended institutional care, which I had arranged out of concern for her well-being. Before she could be transported safely, she fled." His voice hardened. "I have reason to believe someone may be sheltering her, perhaps unaware of her condition." Garrett met the man's gaze steadily. "That's a troubling situation, Mr. Bishop. But as I said, I haven't seen anyone matching your wife's description." Bishop studied him for a long moment, then abruptly changed tactics. "You live alone, I understand." "I do," Garrett confirmed, sensing the trap but unsure how to avoid it. "Then you wouldn't object to us having a look around your property?" Bishop's tone made it clear this was not a request. "For my peace of mind." Garrett weighed his options. Refusing would only heighten suspicion, possibly leading to Bishop returning with the sheriff. Agreeing would give Willow more time to reach the Line's shack and hide. "I suppose not," Garrett said finally, as if reluctantly conceding. "Though I'd appreciate it if you'd respect my property." Bishop's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. We're all civilized men here." The ride back to the ranch was tense, with Bishop keeping pace beside Garrett while the two associates followed behind. Garrett maintained a casual conversation, asking about conditions in Marysville and the progress of Bishop's mining operations, all while calculating how much time Willow would need to gather her things and flee to the Line's shack. As they approached the ranch, Garrett was relieved to see no sign of Willow or Scout. The cabin door stood slightly ajar, evidence of her hasty departure, but otherwise, the homestead appeared undisturbed. "Nice place you've got, Young," Bishop commented as they dismounted. "Remote, though. Must get lonely out here." "I prefer the quiet," Garrett replied, tying his horse to the hitching post. "Town life never suited me." Bishop nodded thoughtfully, his eyes scanning the property. "Shall we begin with the cabin?" For the next hour, Garrett endured the indignity of watching Bishop and his men search his home. They looked through every room, opened every cupboard, even checked beneath the beds. When they found nothing inside, they moved to the barn, the smokehouse, and the small root cellar behind the cabin. Throughout the search, Bishop maintained an air of cold politeness, but Garrett could see the frustration building in the set of his shoulders and the tightening around his eyes. The two associates were less subtle, becoming increasingly rough with Garrett's possessions as their search proved fruitless. "I believe we're finished here, Mr. Young," Bishop said finally, standing in the yard as the sun began to set. "I apologize for the intrusion." "No harm done," Garrett replied, though the words tasted false in his mouth. Bishop studied him once more, his gaze calculating. "If you should happen to see my wife, I'd appreciate you sending word immediately. As I said, her condition makes her vulnerable." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded paper, handing it to Garrett. "This is her likeness, drawn by an artist in Helena, and a description should you encounter her. Garrett unfolded the paper, his heart pounding as he looked at her remarkably accurate sketch of Willow. The description beneath labeled her as Willow Bishop, née Martinez. Age 21, dark hair, dark eyes, approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall, slender build. May appear rational at times but subject to dangerous delusions and hysteria. "I'll keep an eye out," Garrett said, refolding the paper and tucking it into his shirt pocket. Bishop mounted his horse, looking down at Garrett with a cold smile. "I should mention, Mr. Young, that harboring a woman in my wife's condition, preventing her from receiving the care she desperately needs, would be not only a moral failure but potentially a legal one. The sheriff is quite clear on his duty in this matter." The threat was unmistakable. Garrett met Bishop's gaze without flinching. "I understand completely, Mr. Bishop, but as you've seen for yourself, there's no one here but me." With a final nod, Bishop signaled to his men and the 3 riders departed. Garrett remained in the yard until they disappeared from sight, then quickly saddled a fresh horse. If Bishop had men watching the property, and Garrett suspected they would expect him to pursue his normal evening routine. Instead, he made a show of checking his cattle in the nearest pasture, gradually working his way toward the western ridge until darkness provided cover for him to change direction toward the line shack. The mountain trail was treacherous in the dark, but Garrett knew every inch of his land. It took him nearly 2 hours to reach the small cabin nestled in a clearing among the pines. A faint light glowed from the single window, confirming Willow had arrived safely. As he approached, Scout emerged from the shadows, greeting him with a soft whine. Garrett dismounted, patting the dog's head reassuringly before tying his horse beside Willow's mount. "It's Garrett," he called softly as he approached the door, not wanting to frighten her. The door opened immediately, revealing Willow with a rifle in her hands, one of the weapons Garrett kept at the line shack for protection against predators. Her face was pale but determined, relaxing into relief when she saw him. "You made it," she breathed, lowering the rifle. "I was so worried." Garrett stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The line shack was simple, one room with a stone fireplace, a small table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cot. Willow had lit a lantern and built a small fire, which cast flickering shadows on the log walls. "Bishop and his men searched the ranch," Garrett explained, removing his hat and coat. "They're gone now, but I don't think they're convinced." Willow sank into one of the chairs, the rifle across her lap. Did he say anything about me?" Garrett hesitated, then decided she deserved the truth. "He's telling people you're mentally unstable, that he arranged for institutional care for your own good." He pulled out the folded paper Bishop had given him and handed it to her. "He's distributed these throughout the territory." Willow stared at the sketch of herself, her fingers tracing the cruel description beneath. "Dangerous delusions and hysteria," she read aloud, her voice hollow. "How can he?" she broke off, shaking her head. "No, I know exactly how he can. Edward always excelled at making lies sound like truth." Garrett sat in the chair opposite her. "Willow, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." When she nodded, he continued, "Is there anyone who can corroborate your story? Anyone who witnessed Edward's abuse or knew of your fear of him?" "The housekeeper, Mrs. Collins," Willow said after a moment's thought. "She tended my injuries more than once, though Edward always made excuses, claiming I had fallen or was clumsy." She twisted her hands together. "And there was Dr. Morrison, who treated me after the worst incident. Edward told him I had fallen down the stairs, but I think the doctor suspected the truth." Garrett nodded, considering this information. Would either of them be willing to speak against Bishop? Willow's bitter laugh held no humor. "Edward owns half the town, Garrett," Mrs. Collins has 5 children to feed, and Dr. Morrison's practice depends on mining families for survival. Who would risk everything to help a woman already labeled as crazy? The hopelessness in her voice cut Garrett deeply. He leaned forward, taking her hands in his. "I would," he said simply. "I do." Willow looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Why, you barely know me. I've brought nothing but trouble to your door." "That's not true," Garrett said firmly. "You've brought—" He hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't frighten her with their intensity. "Life. Light. Things I didn't realize were missing until you arrived." A tear spilled down Willow's cheek. "Garrett, let me finish," he said gently. "I know this isn't the right time. You're still legally bound to another man, still in danger. But when this is over, however it ends, I want you to know that you have a place here if you want it. Not as a guest or a hired hand, but as—" He took a deep breath. "As whatever you wish to be." Willow's fingers tightened around his. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything now," Garrett assured her. "Just know that you're not alone in this." She nodded, another tear following the first. Garrett released her hands, giving her space to process his words. He stood and moved to the fireplace, adding another log to the flames. "You should rest," he said, his back to her as he arranged the fire. "Take the cot. I'll keep watch tonight." "Garrett," Willow said softly. When he turned to look at her, she had risen from her chair and stood in the center of the small room, her expression resolute despite her tears. "I need you to know something too. These past weeks with you, they've shown me what life can be when it's built on respect and kindness instead of fear." She took a step toward him. "Whatever happens, I'll never regret the time I've spent here, with you." The space between them seemed charged with unspoken feelings, with possibilities that circumstances wouldn't yet allow them to explore. Garrett wanted nothing more than to cross that space, to take her in his arms and promise that everything would be all right. But he knew such promises would be empty until the threat of Bishop was resolved. Instead, he nodded, acknowledging her words and the courage it took to speak them. "Try to get some sleep," he said gently. "We'll figure out our next steps in the morning." Willow smiled faintly, accepting the practical necessity of his response. She moved to the cot, settling on the thin mattress without bothering to remove her boots, ready to flee at a moment's notice if necessary. Garrett took his position in the chair nearest the door, his rifle across his knees, Scout lying at his feet. As the night deepened around the small cabin, he watched Willow finally surrender to exhaustion, her breathing becoming deep and regular in sleep. In the quiet darkness, Garrett allowed himself to imagine a future where they wouldn't need to hide, where Willow could live freely without fear, where the feelings growing between them could be acknowledged and explored. It seemed an impossible dream, given Bishop's power and determination. Yet as Garrett watched over Willow's sleeping form, he silently vowed to make that dream a reality, whatever the cost. Morning came with a soft rain pattering on the roof of the lined shack. Garrett, who had dozed fitfully throughout the night, stirred at the first gray light of dawn. Willow was already awake, sitting on the edge of the cot and braiding her long hair. "How long have you been up?" Garrett asked, stretching to ease the stiffness in his back. "Not long," Willow replied, securing her braid with a strip of fabric. "I'm used to early mornings." They shared a simple breakfast of jerky and hardtack from the supplies Garrett kept stocked in the lined shack. As they ate, they discussed their options, which seemed painfully limited. "I could keep heading west," Willow suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "If I can reach Oregon, perhaps start a new life under a different name." "Bishop has connections throughout the territory," Garrett pointed out. "And beyond, I'd wager. With that sketch circulating, someone would recognize you eventually." Willow sighed, setting aside her half-eaten breakfast. Then what? I can't stay hidden in these hills forever. Garrett considered the problem from all angles. Running wasn't a viable long-term solution, neither was hiding, which left only one path forward: confrontation. We need to discredit Bishop's claims, he said finally. Find evidence of his abuse, witnesses willing to speak the truth. I told you, no one will stand against him, Willow reminded him. He's too powerful. Maybe, Garrett acknowledged, but even the most powerful men have weaknesses, secrets they don't want revealed. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What do you know about his business dealings? Any rumors of questionable practices? Willow's expression shifted from hopelessness to thoughtful consideration. Edward is meticulous about his public image, but there were things. She hesitated. Late-night meetings with men I wasn't supposed to see. Papers hidden away in his study that he never allowed me to touch. And once, I overheard an argument between Edward and his business partner, something about claiming mining rights that didn't belong to them. Garrett nodded encouragingly. That's a start. Who was this partner? Thomas Wheaton, Willow replied. He owns the bank in Marysville. Do you think Wheaton might be willing to talk if approached carefully? Willow considered this. Perhaps. Their argument was bitter, and I noticed Edward excluded him from social gatherings afterward. She frowned, thinking. There was also Edward's secretary, Mr. Jenkins. A quiet man, but I sometimes thought he disapproved of Edward's methods. He was always kind to me in his way. The rain had stopped by the time they finished their discussion, a plan beginning to take shape between them. Garrett would return to the ranch alone, maintaining the appearance of his normal routine while making discreet inquiries in town. Willow would remain at the line shack, where Scout would stay with her for protection and company. I don't like leaving you here alone, Garrett said as he prepared to depart. I'll be fine, Willow assured him, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Scout and I will keep each other company, and I have the rifle if needed. Garrett reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, pressing it into her palm. Take this, just in case. Willow opened her hand to reveal a small silver whistle on a leather cord. What's this for? It carries for miles in these hills, Garrett explained. If you're in danger, blow it. I'll come running. Willow slipped the cord over her head, tucking the whistle beneath her collar. Be careful in town, Garrett. Edward won't hesitate to hurt anyone who helps me. I can take care of myself, Garrett assured her, though he knew Bishop's reach was long and his methods potentially ruthless. Before he could think better of it, Garrett stepped forward and placed a gentle kiss on Willow's forehead. I'll be back tomorrow with supplies, he promised, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't fully express. Hold tight until then. Willow's eyes met his, a world of unspoken feelings passing between them. I will, she whispered. The ride back to the ranch gave Garrett time to refine his plan. Direct confrontation with Bishop was too dangerous. The man had wealth, influence, and apparently the law on his side. Instead, Garrett would need to gather evidence quietly, build a case that even Bishop's money couldn't dismiss. His first stop would be the town of Helena, larger and less under Bishop's thumb than Marysville. There, he might find a lawyer willing to advise him on Willow's legal options, perhaps even a sympathetic judge who could issue a protective order. As he approached his property, Garrett scanned the surrounding hills carefully, alert for any sign of watchers. Nothing seemed amiss, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. After tending to his horse and completing essential chores around the ranch, he saddled a fresh mount and headed for Helena, a journey of several hours. The territorial capital bustled with activity when Garrett arrived. He made his way to the courthouse, where he inquired after a lawyer named James Cooper, whom he had met briefly during a land dispute 2 years prior. Cooper had struck him as honest and unafraid of powerful interests, qualities Garrett desperately needed now. The lawyer's office was modest but well kept, located above a dry goods store on the main street. Cooper, a lean man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and a carefully trimmed beard, greeted Garrett with cautious curiosity. "Mr. Young, isn't it? The rancher from near Marysville." When Garrett nodded, Cooper gestured to a chair. "What brings you to Helena?" "Another boundary dispute, a more personal matter," Garrett replied, taking the offered seat. "One requiring discretion." Cooper raised an eyebrow but closed his office door before returning to his desk. "I'm listening." Choosing his words carefully, Garrett outlined Willow's situation without revealing her current whereabouts. He explained Bishop's accusations of mental instability, the alleged abuse, and the search currently underway. Cooper listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly troubled. When Garrett finished, the lawyer leaned back in his chair with a deep sigh. "You're treading in dangerous waters, Mr. Young. Edward Bishop is not a man to cross lightly. His influence extends well beyond Marysville." "I'm aware of the risks," Garrett said grimly, "but I can't stand by while an innocent woman is condemned to an asylum for the crime of trying to escape an abusive husband." Cooper nodded slowly. "You're concerned as you credit. However, the law in these matters is not always just. A husband has considerable legal authority over his wife. Without concrete evidence of abuse or witnesses willing to testify, Mrs. Bishop has few legal options." "What about divorce?" Garrett asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Difficult," Cooper admitted. "In Montana territory, a wife can petition for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty, but she must provide proof. Given Bishop's claim that his wife is mentally unsound, any petition she filed would likely be dismissed." He tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the desk. "There might be another approach, however." "I'm listening," Garrett said, leaning forward. "If Bishop has engaged in illegal business practices, as you suggest, exposing those might create enough scandal to make him amenable to a quiet divorce settlement." Cooper's eyes narrowed. "Of course, gathering such evidence would be extremely risky. Bishop wouldn't hesitate to retaliate against anyone investigating him." "I'll take that risk," Garrett said without hesitation. Cooper studied him for a long moment. "You care for this woman," he observed. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Garrett didn't deny it. "I do." "Then I'll help you," Cooper decided. "But we must proceed with extreme caution. Bishop has friends in the territorial government and informants throughout the region." For the next hour, they discussed strategy. Cooper would discreetly research Bishop's business dealings and legal history, while Garrett would approach potential witnesses in Marysville, beginning with Thomas Wheaton and Mr. Jenkins, the secretary Willow had mentioned. "Be careful how you frame your questions," Cooper advised as Garrett prepared to leave. "Don't mention Mrs. Bishop directly. Express concern about investing in Bishop's mining operations, perhaps, or curiosity about his business methods." Garrett nodded, grateful for the lawyer's guidance. "I'll send word when I have information." "One more thing," Cooper added, his expression grave. "If Bishop discovers you're harboring his wife, he won't hesitate to use the law against you. Kidnapping, interference with parental rights, the charges could be severe." "She came to me for help," Garrett said firmly. "I won't turn her away." Cooper sighed. "Just be prepared for the consequences, Mr. Young, and keep Mrs. Bishop somewhere safe in the meantime." The ride back to Marysville was tense, Garrett's mind racing with plans and contingencies. He arrived in town as dusk was falling, the streets quieting as businesses closed for the day. Rather than risk being seen making inquiries, he decided to spend the night at the Marysville Hotel, beginning his investigations fresh in the morning. The hotel was modest but clean, catering primarily to business travelers and the occasional tourist drawn by the mining operations. Garrett checked in under his own name using an alias would only arouse suspicion, and took a room on the second floor with a view of the main street. After a simple dinner in the hotel dining room, Garrett retired to his room, though sleep eluded him. His thoughts kept returning to Willow, alone in the line shack with only Scout for protection. The rational part of him knew she was safer there than anywhere else, but worry gnawed at him nonetheless. Morning brought clear skies and renewed determination. Garrett breakfasted early, then made his way to the Marysville Bank, arriving just as Thomas Wheaton was unlocking the front doors. "Mr. Wheaton," Garrett called, approaching with a friendly nod. "Garrett Young. Don't know if you remember me. I have the cattle ranch out past Miller's Creek." Wheaton, a portly man in his 40s with thinning hair and spectacles, regarded him with mild surprise. "Mr. Young, of course. You took out a small loan when you first purchased your property, as I recall." "That's right," Garrett confirmed, pleased that the banker remembered him. "Paid it off 2 years ago." "Indeed you did," Wheaton agreed, gesturing for Garrett to enter the bank. "What brings you to town today?" "Another loan, perhaps. Actually, I've been considering some investments," Garrett said as they moved into the banker's private office. "I've had a good year with the cattle and I'm looking to diversify a bit." Wheaton nodded approvingly. "A wise strategy. What sort of investments did you have in mind?" "I've heard Bishop Mining Company has been producing impressive returns," Garrett said, watching Wheaton's reaction carefully. "Thought I might purchase some shares." The banker's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Bishop's operation is indeed profitable," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "However, investment opportunities there are limited. Mr. Bishop prefers to keep ownership concentrated among a select group." "I see," Garrett said, affecting disappointment. "I had hoped." "Well, given your partnership with Bishop, I thought you might be able to make an introduction." Wheaton removed his spectacles, polishing them with a handkerchief, a delaying tactic, Garrett suspected. "My association with Mr. Bishop has become somewhat distant in recent months," the banker admitted finally. "Business disagreements, you understand." "That's unfortunate," Garrett sympathized. "I've heard Bishop can be a difficult man to work with." Wheaton replaced his spectacles, studying Garrett with new interest. "Mr. Young, forgive my directness, but what is your real reason for asking about Edward Bishop? You've never struck me as a man particularly interested in mining ventures." Caught off guard by the banker's perception, Garrett hesitated. Then, deciding to take a calculated risk, he leaned forward and lowered his voice. "In truth, Mr. Wheaton, I've heard concerning rumors about Bishop's business practices. Before committing any funds, I wanted to assess the risks." Something shifted in Wheaton's expression, a mixture of caution and what might have been relief. "Mr. Young, I think we should continue this conversation elsewhere. Would you be available for dinner this evening? My home, perhaps, at 7. Surprised but encouraged by this turn of events, Garrett nodded. "I would be honored, Mr. Wheaton." The banker scribbled an address on a piece of paper and handed it to Garrett. "Until this evening, then, and Mr. Young," his voice dropped to a near whisper, "I would appreciate your discretion in this matter." Garrett pocketed the address, a sense of cautious optimism growing within him. "Of course, Mr. Wheaton, you have my word." With several hours to fill before his dinner with Wheaton, Garrett decided to seek out Mr. Jenkins, the secretary Willow had mentioned. A casual inquiry at the general store revealed that Jenkins lived in a small house behind the Methodist church and could often be found at the town library during his lunch hour. The library was a modest building, donated by a wealthy mine owner who had struck it rich in the early days of Marysville. When Garrett entered, he found only two patrons, an elderly woman browsing shelves of poetry, and a thin, scholarly-looking man in his 30s, seated at a table with a book and a half-eaten sandwich. Recognizing the description Willow had given, Garrett approached the table. "Mr. Jenkins." The man looked up, startled. "Yes." His voice was soft, his manner reserved. "My name is Garrett Young," he introduced himself, keeping his voice low. "I wonder if I might have a word with you about Edward Bishop." Jenkins's face paled slightly, his eyes darting to the library door as if checking for observers. "I don't think, please," Garrett interrupted gently. "It's important. It concerns Mrs. Bishop." At the mention of Willow, Jenkins's expression changed, concern replacing fear. Is she all right?" he asked hesitantly. "For now," Garrett replied, encouraged by the secretary's reaction. "But she needs help." Jenkins closed his book, his sandwich forgotten. "Not here," he said quietly. "There's a small park behind the church. I'll meet you there in 10 minutes. Garrett nodded his understanding and left the library, making his way to the designated meeting place. The park was little more than a grassy area with a few benches, but it was private, screened from the street by the church building. True to his word, Jenkins appeared 10 minutes later, looking nervous but determined. He sat beside Garrett on a bench partially hidden by an old oak tree. "You know where she is?" Jenkins said without preamble. "Mrs. Bishop." "I do," Garrett admitted, seeing no point in denial. "She came to me for help after escaping from her husband." Jenkins nodded, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "The stories Bishop is spreading about her, their lies. Mrs. Bishop is one of the sanest, most level-headed women I've ever known." He twisted his hands in his lap. "I should have done something sooner. I saw the bruises, the fear in her eyes. But Bishop is a powerful man, and I was a coward." "You're talking to me now," Garrett pointed out gently. "That takes courage." Jenkins gave a bitter laugh. "Perhaps. Or perhaps it's simply that I can no longer live with myself." He drew a deep breath. "What do you want to know?" For the next half hour, Jenkins shared what he knew of Bishop's treatment of Willow and his business practices. The secretary confirmed Willow's account of abuse, describing instances when she had arrived at the office with poorly concealed injuries and Bishop's increasingly controlling behavior. More damning, however, was what Jenkins revealed about Bishop's business dealings. The land claim for his largest mine, it was falsified, Jenkins confessed. The original claim belonged to a prospector named Harlow, who died under suspicious circumstances. Bishop bribed the claims office to transfer ownership, then backdated the documents. "You have proof of this?" Garrett asked, his pulse quickening. Jenkins hesitated. "I kept copies of certain documents, insurance, I suppose, though I never thought I'd have the courage to use them." He glanced nervously around the empty park. "They're hidden in my home. I can bring them to you, but it would have to be after dark, if Bishop suspected." "I understand," Garrett assured him. "Your safety is important." They arranged to meet at midnight behind the church, where Jenkins would deliver the documents. As they parted, Jenkins gripped Garrett's arm with surprising strength. "Tell Mrs. Bishop I'm sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for not helping her sooner, for being afraid." "You're helping her now," Garrett reminded him. "That's what matters." As the day progressed, Garrett's sense of cautious optimism grew. His dinner with Wheaton proved even more productive than he had hoped. In the privacy of the banker's home, Wheaton revealed that his business disagreement with Bishop stemmed from discovering the mine owner's fraudulent land claims and strong-arm tactics with competing businesses. "He's ruined good men," Wheaton said grimly over after-dinner brandy. "Forced them out of business, taken their claims, even driven some from the territory entirely." "Why haven't you gone to the authorities?" Garrett asked. Wheaton's laugh held no humor. "Bishop owns the local sheriff, has friends in the territorial government, and he's not above more direct methods of silencing opposition." He sipped his brandy, his expression darkening. "A man who challenged one of Bishop's claims last year was found dead at the bottom of a mine shaft. Accident, they called it. But if enough people came forward," Garrett suggested, "with enough evidence—" "Perhaps," Wheaton conceded, "but it would take considerable courage and coordination." He studied Garrett over the rim of his glass. "This isn't just about business concerns for you, is it, Mr. Young? This is about Willow Martinez." Startled by the banker's insight, Garrett didn't immediately respond. "You needn't confirm it," Wheaton continued, "but I want you to know I was fond of Willow. She deserved far better than Edward Bishop." He set down his glass with deliberate care. "If you're helping her, you're a braver man than I, and you'll need all the allies you can get." By the time Garrett left Wheaton's home, he had gained not only a potential witness against Bishop, but also the promise of financial backing if legal proceedings became necessary. The banker had also hinted at other business owners who harbored grievances against Bishop, men who might be persuaded to speak out if given sufficient protection. At midnight, as arranged, Garrett met Jenkins behind the church. The secretary arrived punctually, a leather satchel clutched tightly in his hands. "Everything I could gather is here," Jenkins said, passing the satchel to Garrett. "Land records, financial documents, correspondence regarding competing claims. Some of it is incriminating." Garrett accepted the satchel with a grateful nod. "This could make all the difference, Mr. Jenkins. Thank you." Jenkins glanced nervously into the darkness. "I should get back. If Bishop discovers these documents are missing—" "Be careful," Garrett warned. "If you feel you're in danger, come to my ranch. It's 5 miles west of town, just past Miller's Creek." Jenkins nodded, then disappeared into the night, leaving Garrett with a satchel of evidence that might finally free Willow from her husband's control. The following morning, Garrett rode out of Marysville with the satchel securely stowed in his saddlebags. His next stop was Helena, where he would deliver the documents to Cooper for review. But first, he needed to check on Willow, to assure himself of her safety and share the promising developments. As his horse climbed the trail toward the line shack, Garrett rehearsed what he would tell her about Wheaton's support, Jenkins's courage, the growing possibility of legal action against Bishop. For the first time since finding her beneath his wagon, he felt genuine hope for a resolution that wouldn't require Willow to spend her life running. The clearing where the line shack stood came into view, and Garrett reined his horse to a stop, his blood turning to ice. The cabin door hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze. There was no sign of Scout or Willow. Dismounting quickly, Garrett drew his revolver and approached the cabin with caution. The interior was in disarray, the small table overturned, blankets scattered on the floor. Signs of a struggle, but no blood that he could see. Relief at that small mercy was quickly overwhelmed by fear. "Willow," he called, knowing there would be no answer but unable to stop himself. "Scout," only silence greeted him. Holstering his revolver, Garrett searched the cabin and surrounding area methodically, looking for any clue to what had happened. Near the edge of the clearing, he found what he was looking for: multiple hoofprints indicating at least 3 riders. A scrap of fabric caught on a branch that he recognized as coming from Willow's dress. And most telling, a set of tracks leading away that included Scout's distinctive paw prints. The dog had followed whoever had taken Willow, and Garrett knew exactly where they were headed: back to Marysville, back to Bishop. Cold fury replaced fear as Garrett mounted his horse. Bishop had found her somehow. Perhaps he had been watched more carefully than he realized, Or maybe someone in town had connected his sudden interest in Bishop with the search for the missing wife. It didn't matter now. What mattered was getting Willow back before Bishop could carry out his threat to institutionalize her. The ride back to Marysville was a blur, Garrett pushing his horse to its limits. He went directly to Cooper's office in Helena, bursting in without ceremony, the satchel of documents in hand. "Bishop has her," he announced without preamble. "He's found Willow." Cooper rose from his desk, alarmed by Garrett's appearance and tone. "Are you certain?" "Someone took her from the line shack," Garrett confirmed grimly. "And my dog followed them. It has to be Bishop." "This complicates matters," Cooper said, taking the satchel and quickly examining its contents. "But it doesn't change our strategy. These documents, they're exactly what we needed. Evidence of fraud, bribery, possibly even involvement in a suspicious death." "How does that help Willow now?" Garrett demanded, pacing the small office. Cooper held up a document, his expression grim. "Because this particular paper suggests Bishop falsified not only land claims, but also his marriage records. According to this correspondence with the county clerk, he paid to have the marriage record backdated by 2 years. What does that mean?" "It means," Cooper said slowly, "that at the time Bishop claims they were married, Willow would have been 16 below the legal age of consent in Montana territory without parental permission. And according to your information, her mother was already deceased by then." Garrett stopped pacing, the implications sinking in. "Are you saying their marriage isn't legal?" "I'm saying we have grounds to challenge its validity," Cooper clarified. "Combined with the evidence of abuse and Bishop's fraudulent business practices, we have leverage." He set the document down carefully. "But we need to move quickly. If Bishop intends to send Willow east to an asylum, he'll want to do it immediately, before anyone can intervene." "What's our next step?" Garrett asked, forcing himself to focus on action rather than fear. Cooper thought for a moment. "We need a judge willing to issue an emergency injunction preventing Bishop from removing Willow from the territory. Judge Hammond is in Helena today. He's no friend to corrupt businessmen. With these documents and sworn statements from Wheaton and Jenkins, he might act." "How quickly?" "If we go to him now, perhaps by this afternoon," Cooper estimated. "But Garrett," he hesitated, his expression grave. "Even with an injunction, Bishop won't surrender Willow easily. This could turn dangerous." "It already has," Garrett said grimly. "Let's get that injunction." The next several hours passed in a flurry of activity. Cooper arranged an emergency meeting with Judge Hammond, presenting the evidence from Jenkins's satchel along with affidavits hastily obtained from Wheaton and other businessmen who had suffered from Bishop's unethical practices. Garrett provided his own sworn statement regarding Willow's condition when he found her and her account of Bishop's abuse. Judge Hammond, a stern man with a reputation for incorruptibility, reviewed the materials with growing concern. By late afternoon, he had issued not only an injunction preventing Bishop from removing Willow from Montana territory, but also a warrant for Bishop's arrest on charges of fraud, bribery, and falsification of public records. "This doesn't guarantee Mrs. Bishop's safety," the judge warned as he handed the documents to Cooper. "But it provides legal grounds for intervention. I've instructed the federal marshal to execute the warrant immediately." Armed with the judge's orders, Garrett and Cooper, accompanied by Federal Marshal Daniel Ryder and 2 deputies, rode for Marysville at full speed. They arrived just as dusk was falling, the streets quiet as townsfolk retreated to their homes for the evening. Bishop's mansion stood on a hill overlooking the town, a grand statement of wealth and power that now seemed to Garrett like a fortress to be breached. Lights blazed from every window, and as they approached, Garrett spotted a carriage waiting in the circular drive, trunks strapped to its roof. "Looks like we arrived just in time," Marshal Ryder observed grimly. "He's planning to move her tonight." They approached the house cautiously, Ryder and his deputies taking the lead while Cooper and Garrett followed. As they reached the front steps, the door opened, revealing Edward Bishop himself, dressed for travel and clearly surprised by their arrival. "Marshal Ryder," Bishop said, recovering quickly. "This is unexpected. What brings you to my home at this hour?" Ryder stepped forward, presenting the warrant. "Edward Bishop, I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, bribery, and falsification of public records. I also have an injunction prohibiting the removal of Willow Martinez Bishop from Montana territory." Bishop's composure slipped for just a moment, shock and fury flashing across his face before he regained control. "This is absurd," he declared, though he made no move to take the warrant. "My wife is unwell. I'm simply escorting her to a facility where she can receive proper care." "Nevertheless," Ryder insisted, "I must execute this warrant and ensure Mrs. Bishop remains in the territory pending further legal proceedings." Bishop's eyes hardened as they fell on Garrett. "I see," he said coldly. "This is your doing, Young, interfering in matters that don't concern you." "Where is she?" Garrett demanded, stepping forward despite Cooper's restraining hand on his arm. Before Bishop could answer, a commotion from within the house drew their attention. Scout came bounding down the grand staircase, barking frantically, followed by two men attempting to restrain him. Behind them, being half led, half dragged down the stairs, was Willow. She wore a traveling dress of expensive material, but her face was pale and drawn, her eyes wide with a drugged confusion that made Garrett's blood boil. When she saw him, however, recognition flashed in her gaze. "Garrett," she called, her voice weak but determined. "Garrett, help me." The men holding her tightened their grip, but Scout, seizing the moment of distraction, lunged at one of them, sinking his teeth into the man's arm. With a howl of pain, the man released Willow, who stumbled forward. Everything happened at once. Bishop reached inside his coat, presumably for a weapon. Marshal Ryder and his deputies drew their revolvers. The second man holding Willow pulled her back, using her as a shield. And Garrett, seeing only Willow's fear and the danger she was in, charged up the stairs. "Stop," Ryder commanded, but it was too late. Garrett reached the man holding Willow, driving his shoulder into him with enough force to separate them. Willow stumbled forward, collapsing against the stair railing. The man regained his balance and swung at Garrett, landing a glancing blow to his jaw before Garrett countered with a right hook that sent him sprawling. "Enough!" Bishop's voice rang out, and Garrett turned to see him standing at the foot of the stairs, a pistol in his hand. "This has gone far enough. My wife is leaving with me tonight, regardless of your so-called warrant." Ryder's revolver was trained steadily on Bishop. "Lower your weapon, Bishop. Don't make this worse than it already is." For a tense moment, no one moved. Garrett, still on the stairs, positioned himself in front of Willow, who was struggling to stand despite whatever drug Bishop had administered. Scout growled, hackles raised, ready to attack at Garrett's command. Then, unexpectedly, the front door opened again. Thomas Wheaton entered, followed by Jenkins, and several other men Garrett recognized as business owners from Marysville. "It's over, Edward," Wheaton said quietly. "We've all signed affidavits detailing your illegal activities. The evidence has been presented to Judge Hammond. There's no escape this time." Bishop's gaze darted from face to face, the reality of his situation slowly sinking in. The pistol in his hand wavered, then lowered slightly. "You can't prove anything," he said, but the confidence had drained from his voice. "We can prove enough," Cooper replied, stepping forward with the satchel of documents. "Enough to ensure you never harm Willow again. At the mention of her name, Bishop's expression hardened once more. "She's my wife," he hissed. "Mine to do with as I please." "No," Willow said, her voice stronger than before as she stood with Garrett's support. "I was never truly your wife, Edward. Our marriage was built on lies and fear from the beginning." Bishop's face contorted with rage. He raised his pistol again, not at Marshal Ryder or his deputies, but at Willow. "If I can't have you," he snarled, "no one will." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Garrett pulled Willow behind him as Bishop fired. Pain exploded in his left shoulder, the force of the bullet spinning him around. Scout launched himself at Bishop, knocking the pistol from his hand. The deputies surged forward, subduing Bishop as he screamed threats and curses. And Willow, somehow finding strength through her fear and the lingering effects of whatever drug she had been given, knelt beside Garrett on the stairs, pressing her hands against his bleeding shoulder. "Garrett," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Garrett, stay with me. Please stay with me." Through the haze of pain, Garrett reached up to touch her face. "Not going anywhere," he promised, his voice hoarse. "Told you I'd come for you." As Marshal Ryder secured Bishop and Cooper called for a doctor, Willow held Garrett's hand against her cheek, her tears falling onto his palm. "I knew you would," she said softly. "I never doubted it for a moment." The weeks that followed were a blur of recovery and legal proceedings. Garrett's wound, while painful, proved less serious than initially feared. The bullet had passed through his shoulder without hitting bone or major blood vessels. Under Mrs. Baxter's care, supplemented by daily visits from Willow, he regained his strength gradually. Bishop remained in custody, denied bail due to the seriousness of the charges against him and the risk of flight. As Cooper had predicted, the evidence of fraudulent business practices was overwhelming once witnesses began to come forward. The revelation that his marriage to Willow had been improperly documented provided grounds for an annulment, which Judge Hammond granted with unusual speed. Willow, legally free and gradually recovering from her ordeal, stayed at Garrett's ranch throughout his convalescence. Mrs. Baxter, who had quickly grown fond of the young woman, provided a proper chaperone, though her knowing smiles suggested she understood perfectly well what was developing between Willow and Garrett. By mid-July, Garrett was well enough to resume most of his duties around the ranch, though Willow insisted he avoid any heavy lifting or strenuous work. They fell into a comfortable routine, sharing meals, working side by side on manageable tasks, sitting on the porch in the evenings as the sun set over the mountains. On a warm evening in late July, as they sat watching Scout chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Garrett finally found the courage to speak the words that had been in his heart since the day he found Willow beneath his wagon. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice a little gruff with nervousness, "about the future, your future specifically." Willow turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the last golden light of sunset. "Have you?" Garrett nodded, shifting to face her more directly. "You're free now." "Legally, officially free. You could go anywhere, do anything you choose." "Yes," Willow agreed softly, "I could. But I'm hoping," Garrett paused, gathering his courage, "I'm hoping you might choose to stay here, with me." He reached for her hand, his fingers gentle against hers. "I love you, Willow. I think I've loved you since that first morning when you emerged from beneath my wagon, dignity intact despite everything." Willow's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. "I love you too, Garrett Young. How could I not? You saved my life in every way a life can be saved." "Is that a yes?" Garrett asked, hope swelling in his chest. Willow laughed, the sound like music after so many months of fear and uncertainty. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to staying. Yes to building a life here." Yes to loving you for as long as we both shall live." Garrett pulled her gently into his arms, mindful of his still healing shoulder, and kissed her for the first time, a kiss that held all the promise of the future they would build together. They were married in September, a small ceremony performed by the pastor from Marysville, with Mrs. Baxter, Thomas Wheaton, Jenkins, and a handful of neighbors as witnesses. Willow wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Baxter had helped her make, with wildflowers in her hair and a smile that outshone the autumn sun. Edward Bishop was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and attempted murder, sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. His empire crumbled, his assets divided among those he had wronged over the years. Willow, wanting no part of his wealth, asked only for a small settlement to be donated to a home for abused women recently established in Helena. Life at the ranch settled into a rhythm of hard work and deep contentment. Willow's natural abilities with gardening expanded their vegetable plot into a thriving garden that produced enough to sell excess at the Marysville market. Garrett's cattle business prospered, allowing them to hire additional help and expand their holdings. By the spring of 1872, Willow was expecting their first child. On a perfect June morning with Mrs. Baxter and the doctor in attendance, she gave birth to a healthy son they named Samuel, after Garrett's father. 2 years later, a daughter followed, Elizabeth, named for Willow's mother. As the years passed, the ranch grew and prospered. The children filled the once quiet cabin with laughter and chaos. Scout became their devoted guardian, and the love between Garrett and Willow deepened with each passing season. Sometimes, on summer evenings when the children were asleep, and the world was painted in shades of purple and gold, they would sit on the porch and remember that first meeting her, terrified and desperate beneath his wagon, him offering coffee and biscuits instead of questions. "Do you ever regret it?" Willow asked once, her head resting against his shoulder as they watched the stars emerge. "Taking in a stranger who brought so much trouble to your door?" Garrett's arm tightened around her, his lips brushing her temple. "Not for a single moment," he said with absolute certainty. "Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me." Willow smiled, nestling closer against him. "Even better than finding gold, better than all the gold in Montana," Garrett assured her. "Because what I found under that wagon was far more precious, the woman who would become my heart, my home, my everything." As darkness settled over the Montana hills and their children slept safely inside, Garrett and Willow Young sat together under the vast sky. Two souls who had found in each other not just love, but sanctuary, the greatest treasure the Wild West could offer.